A Daughter of the Samurai. Chapter 10. The Day of the Bird. Brother had been at home a year when the letters from his friend in America began coming more frequently. After each one, grandmother, brother and mother would have long talks, and not all of them were happy ones. In a vague way, I sometimes thought these discussions had something to do with me, and one day was a little troubled when a long conference ended by brother's abruptly coming out of the room with only a short bow that was almost rude. He started swiftly towards the door, then turning came back and stood by my side, looking steadily at me for a moment. But he went on without saying a word. Several weeks later, a thick, heavy letter came, one with many stamps, and after another talk in grandmother's room, brother sent Gia out with a long lacquer box tied with a cord which I knew held a rounding letter for all relatives. Gia would wait at each place for it to be read before carrying it on to the next place. That afternoon I noticed mother was very thoughtful and quiet, and grandmother sat by her firebox, silent and stern, with her long slender pipe in her hand. The tiny bowl held only 3 puffs, and after refilling it twice, she put it away, but she seemed to have forgotten it that day and sat holding it a long time. The next day there was a meeting of the family council. It has always been a Japanese custom to decide important family problems by calling an assembly of the older relatives. There had been family councils ever since I could remember, but being the youngest of the family and a girl, I was not concerned in them, and I never gave more than a passing thought as to whether this time it would mean the selling of another piece of land or of one of our roll pictures. We had been selling things all my life. Sister and I were so accustomed to seeing the second-hand man go into the big plaster storehouse with old Gia that we made a practice of playing a guessing game as to whether he would come out with a small package in his hands or a big bundle on his shoulders. Mother used to look troubled when a group of men came to look at things, but father would laugh and say, "Useless beauty had her place in the old life, but the new asks only for ugly usefulness." But one thing father never laughed about. Whenever negotiations were pending in regard to land, he was always watchful. The outside limits of our once large estate had gradually been withdrawn within the wall, and year by year they were closing in nearer and nearer to the house. But father would never part with any portion of the garden overlooked by grandmother's room. After his death, brother was equally considerate, so as long as she lived, grandmother could gaze out upon the garden, the stream, and the little slope of azaleas against the background of feathery bamboo, just as she had done for years. This family council was the largest that had been held since father's death. 2 grey-haired uncles were there with the aunts, besides 2 other aunts and a young uncle who had come all the way from Tokyo on purpose for this meeting. They had been in the room a long time, and I was busy writing at my desk when I heard a soft, "Allow me to speak," behind me, and there was Toshi at the door, looking rather excited. "Little mistress," she said with an unusually deep bow, "your honourable mother asks you to go to the room where the guests are." I entered the big room. Brother was sitting by the tokonoma, and next to him were 2 grey-haired uncles and the young uncle from Tokyo. Opposite sat honourable grandmother, the 4 aunts, and mother. Tea had been served and all had cups before them or in their hands. As I pushed back the door, they looked up and gazed at me as if they had never seen me before. I was a little startled, but of course I made a low, ceremonious bow. Mother motioned to me, and I slipped over beside her on the mat. "Etsuko," Mother said very gently, "the gods have been kind to you, and your destiny as a bride has been decided. Your honourable brother and your venerable kindred have given much thought to your future. It is proper that you should express your gratitude to the honourable all." I made a long, low bow, touching my forehead to the floor. Then I went out and returned to my desk and my writing. I had no thought of asking, "Who is it?" I did not think of my engagement as a personal matter at all. It was a family affair. Like every Japanese girl, I had known from babyhood that sometime, as a matter of course, I should marry, but that was a faraway necessity to be considered when the time came. I did not look forward to it. I did not dread it. I did not think of it at all. The fact that I was not quite 13 had nothing to do with it. That was the attitude of all girls. The formal ceremony of the betrothal took place some months later. It was not an elaborate affair, like a wedding, but it was very important. For in old-fashioned families, the betrothal was considered as sacred as the marriage itself, and indeed it could not be nearly so easily broken as might be the marriage tie. There was an air of quiet excitement in the whole house that day. The servants, who always felt a personal interest in everything that happened in the family, had hung weather dolls of folded paper on the nantan bush near the porch to ensure sunshine, and were jubilant over the result. And even Mother, who always seemed more calm when she was excited, went around giving unnecessary directions to various maids. "Be careful in powdering Etsuko-sama's face," I heard her say to Ishi. "Get the paint smooth." And when the hairdresser arrived, Mother made a second trip to the room to give a special order that Etsuko-sama's hair must be pulled straight. As soon as I was dressed, I went to Grandmother's room for morning greetings. Her kindly smile was more gentle than usual, and we had a pleasant talk before breakfast was announced. As we were leaving the room, she reminded me that it was the day of the bird. "Yes, I know," I said. "A betrothal ceremony always takes place on the day of the bird, Honourable Grandmother. Why is it?" "Be not ambitious to be vain," she said, smiling and resting her arm on my shoulder as we walked down the porch. "This day was chosen by your relatives with the kind wish that good fortune will bless your life with silks and brocades as plentiful as the feathers of the birds." Matsuo's aged uncle, Mr. Omori, had arrived from Kyoto a few days before and had been entertained at the home of the go-between. The ceremony had to take place in the waxing rather than the waning of the day, so about the middle of the forenoon, when I went into the best room, I found the others already assembled. Matsuo's uncle was seated on a cushion near the tokonoma. He sat very straight and had a pleasant face. I liked him. Grandmother, brother, Mother, and the two go-betweens were there, and I sat beside Mother. The woman go-between brought to me a small white table with a square of crepe over it, on which was Matsu's crest. It was the engagement gift from his family, and I was looking for the first time upon the crest that I should have to wear all my life. But I did not seriously realize it. Another tray held other gifts, the most important of which was a pair of folding fans, signifying a wish for constantly widening happiness. Then Toshi brought into the room 2 trays and set them before Mr. Omori. It was my family's gift to Matsuo. Of course, I had been told exactly what to do, so I lifted the square of crepe from my table, displaying a roll of magnificent brocade for a sash. On Mr. Omori's tables were the essential pair of fans and a wide pleated silk skirt called hakama, the regulation dress for a Japanese gentleman. These have been the betrothal gifts from time immemorial. I bowed most formal thanks, and Mr. Omori did the same. Then the gifts were placed on the tokonoma, and everybody, even grandmother, made a slight bow and murmured, "Congratulations." Soon after, the maids brought the small tables for our dinner, placing those for the gentlemen on one side of the room and those for the ladies on the other. Then Toshi, with her tray, took her place in the open space at the end of the 2 lines. Each person made a slight bow, and the dinner commenced. The conversation was general and the guests seemed to have a pleasant time, but of course I was very quiet and dignified. The most interesting part of the day, to me, came after everyone had gone and Ishi was taking off my dress. She eyed my head very closely. "Mama Etsubo-sama," she said, "it was such luck that today was cold and dry. Your hair has not one bit of a crinkle." For once, my unruly hair had not disgraced my family, and giving a sigh of relief, I placed my head carefully upon my little wooden pillow and went contentedly to sleep. After my betrothal, my life was a sort of make-believe game, for my education as a wife began that very day. I had already received the usual training in cooking, sewing, and various household duties, as well as flower arranging, tea serving, and other womanly accomplishments. But now I had to put these things into practice as if I were already in my husband's home. I was expected to select without assistance the proper flowers, the suitable roll pictures, and tokonoma ornament, and see that the house was arranged according to certain established rules. Every moment my life was filled with training and preparation. The object was not explained to me, for this education was a taken-for-granted part of every betrothal, and it happened in my case that no special explanation was necessary, other than that I was to be careful not in any way to show disrespect to wood sorrel, since Matsuo's crest was conventionalized wood sorrel, except that I had to learn to like tuna, which was a favorite dish of Matsuo's and which I had never cared for. My diet was not affected at all by my betrothal. Sister had a long training, for she had been betrothed 5 years, including the year of postponement on account of father's death. As her expected husband's crest was conventionalized plum, she never, during the 5 years, tasted plum, even in jelly. It would have been disrespectful. The hardest thing I did that year was to learn how to make a sleeping cushion. I loved to sew and was rather skillful with the needle, but I had never made anything by myself. Ishi or Toshi had always helped me, but every Japanese housewife had to know how to make cushions, for they were our chairs and our beds, so Mother said that I must make a sleeping cushion entirely alone. This was a difficult thing for anyone to do, and my sleeves were wet with foolish tears when for the 4th time I pulled out the threads and turned the immense cushion inside out in order to refit the corners, which, in spite of my persistent efforts, would stay twisted. Another of my duties was the preparation, on anniversaries and at festival time, of a shadow table for my absent fiancé. On these days, I myself cooked the food which brother told us Matsuo especially liked. His table was placed next to mine, and I arranged it to be always served before my own. Thus I learned to be watchful for the comfort of my prospective husband. Grandmother and mother always spoke as if Matsuo were present, and I was as careful of my dress and conduct as if he had already been in the room. Thus I grew to respect him and to respect my own position as his wife. Most of the memories of that time are like faint heartthrob phantoms now, but one always stands out clear and strong. That has to do with a birthday. Japanese people do not, as a rule, observe individual birthdays. Instead, it is the custom to celebrate New Year as a birthday for each person of the nation. This gives a double meaning to the day and makes New Year the most joyously celebrated of any festival of the year. But in our house, one especial birthday was always honoured. That was Matsuo's. This was not on my account. From the time Mother had learned of his kindness to brother, never did a January 8th pass that we did not have an elaborate dinner with a table for Matsuo in the place of honoured as our guest. Mother always kept up this custom, and in later years, when in a far distant land, I have thought, with a mist in my eyes, of the birthday table in my mother's home in the mountains of Japan. During these months, Mother and I came closer to each other than we had ever been before. She did not confide in me, that was not Mother's way, but it seemed that an invisible cord of sympathy was drawing our hearts together. I had always greatly admired my mother, but there was a little awe mixed with my admiration. Father had been my comrade and my friend, as well as my wise adviser, and my whole heart was filled with tender love for my dear, patient, unselfish Ishi. But Mother was aloof, like the sun, flawless and steady, filling the home with life-giving warmth, yet too far away to be treated familiarly. So I was surprised one day when she came quietly to my room and told me there was something she wanted to speak to me about before she told Grandmother. Our house had received word from the go-between that Matsuo had removed to a city in the eastern part of America and had gone into business for himself. On this account, he had decided not to return to Japan for several years and asked that I be sent to him there. Mother always accepted inevitable circumstances with calm resignation, but this was a very unusual and puzzling situation. For generations, Japanese mothers, believing that the destined home for every girl is settled by the gods, having sent their daughters as brides to distant provinces, so my going to America was not a matter of deep concern, but for a bride to go into a home where there was neither mother-in-law nor an elder sister of wisdom age to train her in the ways of the new household was a serious problem. And this was not the case that could be referred to the family council, for I was as much bound to Matsuo as if I were already married, and in his affairs the Inagaki family had no authority. In this strange situation, Mother turned to me, and for the first time in my life, I was consulted in a family matter. I think I changed from a girl to a woman in that hour of conversation with my mother. We decided that, at least for the present, there was but one problem for us to face. That was how to prepare for an unknown life in a strange land. In this, my relatives could take no part. Of course, all were excited and each one volunteered advice, but the only practical suggestion came from Brother. He said I must have an English education. That meant that I should have to be sent to school in Tokyo. All that winter the household was busy getting me ready for school. The pathos of these preparations I did not realize, nor I think did any of us. Mother spent evenings after evening bending her stately head over wonderful embroidered garments, ripping out, stitch by stitch, the exquisite work of hands folded in rest generations ago. Then Ishi would dye the silk and make it into plain garments suitable for my school life. And many things were sold. Grandmother and mother consented to any sacrifice, though sometimes their faces were sad. But brother seemed to have lost all feeling for the precious old belongings and would part with them without one expression of regret. "Treasures are a useless care," he often said. "In a poor house like ours, there is no need to keep dozens of chests of retainers' armour. They had their place in the past, but hereafter the sons of our ancestors must fight on a battlefield of commerce. Business is the key to wealth, and in this new world, wealth is the only power." I thought little of it then, but now it aches me to remember the sword hilt ornaments of exquisite workmanship in gold and silver and bronze that were sold for almost nothing, and I can see even now how the great scales of the dealer in old iron tipped heavily with the weight of swords that were once the pride of our humblest retainers. One cold evening I went into grandmother's room and snuggled down beside her cushion, close to the firebox, just as I used to do in the days which were beginning to seem to me far in the past. We had grown somewhat apart that year. I was no longer the little child she could make happy with sweets, could train in politeness and teach useful lessons by means of fairy lore, and I felt that, much as she loved me, the new conditions that my future faced were beyond her old-fashioned comprehension. But I learned that night, while I talked with her, that samurai training will prepare one for any future. As we sat in the quiet room, lighted only by the soft glow of the charcoal fire, she told me how that very day, 60 years before, she, as a bride, had left her home in a distant province to come to her husband in Nagaoka. Most brides of her rank revisited their homes each year in a long procession of grandeur, but though messengers were sent with inquiries and gifts every New Year and summer festival season, grandmother never, after she entered the marriage palanquin, saw her home or her people again. In those days of slow travel, distance was counted by time rather than miles, and hers was a long trip. She left home on the night of a full moon, and another full moon was in the sky when she was carried through the entrance gate of her husband's home. "I was just your age, 14, she said, and sometimes, as the procession passed through strange provinces, climbing over mountains and crossing wide rivers, I wondered many things. It was farther than Kyoto that I came, and at the gateway of each province there were long waits while the officials of the procession exchanged papers and received permission for us to pass. At these times my nurse always came, and I remained beside my palanquin, and the spear retainers and 6 shoulders of the unskilled carriers were with us, so I did not fear. But the world seemed very strange and large to me, and the people I came to live among were very different from my own. The customs were new, even the language had an accent and an idiom that seemed peculiar. It was like a foreign land, and so of late I have thought much of you and the unknown country to which your fate is taking you. Remember, Etsubo," and her voice was strangely tender. "Where you live is a small matter. The life of a samurai, man or woman, is just the same. Loyalty to the overlord, bravery in defense of his honor. In your distant, destined home, remember grandmother's words. loyalty to your husband, bravery in defense of his honor. It will bring you peace. Chapter 11. My First Journey. That was one of the long Nagaoka winters. For 5 months we saw only snow. In the early spring, our relatives in Tokyo had written that arrangements had been made for my school. From that time, I had been waiting impatiently for the mountain roads to become safe from avalanches, for just as soon as we could travel, Brother was to take me to the capital. At last, the dikes were dry. That was when the snow always melted first, and we had a gathering green picnic as a farewell to my companions in Nagaoka. One sunny morning, a group of us with purple scarves on our heads and kimonos tucked up over our bright skirts dotted the dike slopes, each carrying a small basket and a bamboo knife, and filling the air with laughter and merry calls as we'd hurried up and down the banks, trying to see how many different kinds of green each could find. Often in later years I recall that happy day as my last gay time at home as a girl. Finally, the mail carriers reported that the overhanging snow cliffs had all fallen and the slopes were clear. Soon after came the day of our departure. With a heart half of elation, half of regret, I bade goodbye to Honourable Grandmother and Mother, and with misty eyes was carefully tucked into my jinrikisha by Ishi. Then, between lines of bowing friends, our 2 jinrikishas and baggage-laden horses, led by unskilled workers, started on the 8-day journey to Tokyo. Most of the way we travelled in jinrikishas, changing them at certain towns, but occasionally we had to go on horseback. My saddle was a high box seat, so Brother and the worker rigged up a double basket held by bands across the horse's back. I sat in one part and baggage filled the other. As we went around the steep curving roads on the mountainside, I could lean over and look far, far down to the fisher villages on the coast. But it was more interesting, as we got further along, to look across the deep valley of the sloping hillsides with their terraces of rice fields, odd-shaped patches fitted in like silk pieces of a Buddhist priest's robe. In every little village of thatch-roof huts was a shrine set high in the midst of a few trees, and half hidden in a hollow beside a stream was whirling the great narrow wheel of a rice mill. The air was so clear that I could plainly see the awkward lunge of a water buffalo as he dragged a wooden plough along the furrows of one of the rice patches, and I could even distinguish a scarlet flower stuck between the folds of the towel knotted above the head of the worker behind. In those days, no one ever wore a living flower except to carry it to the dead, so I knew he was taking it home for the house shrine. I wondered what kind of a home he had. I think it was our 3rd day when I noticed that we were leaving the snow country. No longer did the towns have their sidewalks roofed, and these thatches bore no rows of avalanche stones. The houses looked bare and odd, like a married woman's face with newly shaved eyebrows, but we were not entirely beyond the sight of snow, for as we skirted Myoko Mountain, we saw a good many drifts and patches. The jinriksha men said snow lasted there until July. "From the top," said Brother, "you can see Fujiyama." My heart thrilled, and I foolishly turned my head, feeling for a moment that I was really near the sacred mountain, which my eyes had never expected to behold. And then, with a deeper, warmer thrill, I heard the conclusion of his sentence. "And then, if you turn and look in the opposite direction, you can see the plains of Etsuko." "We are very far from home," I replied in a small voice. Brother gave a quick look at my grave face. Then he laughed. "Also, if you look just beyond, you can see the Isle of Sado. If Matsuo should not come up to expectations, here's some advice for you." And his merry voice broke into an old song. "Nikuoto ni kisatai shima wa royagoshi ni sado ga shima." I was shocked that Brother should sing a common servant's song, and doubly shocked when he should joke so lightly about serious things, so my face was still grave as we rolled along in our jinrikishas. The Isle of Sado used to be a place of exile for criminals and was considered by common people as the end of the world. This joking song, which is popular amongst peasant girls, is literally a threat to present to a disliked suitor not the pleated garment, which was the usual gift of the bride to a groom, but instead a convict's garb, meaning, "I pray the gods will send the unwelcome one across the raging seas to the end of the world." We spent our 5th night at Nagano in the temple of Zenkoji, where lived the royal nun, beneath whose high-lifted razor I had walked years before in a procession of gaily clad little girls for a Buddhist ceremony of consecration. The next morning, soon after we started, Brother halted and allowed my jinriksha to roll up to his side. "Etsubo," he asked, "when did they give up making a priestess of you?" "Why, I don't know," I said, surprised. He gave a little scornful laugh and rode on to his place ahead, leaving me silent and thoughtful. I had spoken the truth when I said I did not know. I had always accepted my education with no thought of results, but Brother's laugh had startled me, and rolling along that mountain road, I did a good deal of thinking. At last I believed that I understood. I know my father had never approved, though he acquiesced in Honourable Grandmother's wish that I should be educated for a priestess, and when, after my brother's sad departure, he had quietly substituted studies, which would be of benefit should I ever hold the position of his heir, I think Honourable Grandmother, aching with sympathy for her proud, disappointed son, laid aside her cherished hope, and the plan was silently abandoned. In the province of Shinano, an hour or so from Nagano, my jinriksha man pointed across the river to a small wooded mountain. "Obatsayama it is," he said. How my mind went back to Ishi and her mother love story, which tells of a time long, long ago when there lived at the foot of this mountain a poor farmer and his aged widowed mother. They owned a bit of land which supplied them with food, and their humble lives were peaceful and happy. At that time, Shinano was governed by a despotic ruler who, though a brave warrior, had a great and cowardly shrinking from anything suggestive of fading health and strength. This caused him to send out a cruel proclamation. The entire province was given strict orders immediately to put to death all aged people. Those were barbarous days, and the custom of abandoning old people to die was not uncommon. However, it was not a law, and many of the helpless old lived as long as nature allowed in comfort and welcome homes. The poor farmer loved his aged mother with tender reverence, and the order filled his heart with sorrow. But no one ever thought a second time about obeying the mandate of a daimyo. So with many deep and hopeless sighs, the youth prepared for what at the time was considered the kindest mode of death. Just at sundown, when his day's work was ended, he took a quantity of the unwhitened rice, which is the principal food of the poor, cooked and dried it, and tying it in a square of cloth, he swung the bundle around his neck, along with a gourd filled with cool, sweet water. Then he lifted his helpless old mother to his back and started on his painful journey up the mountain. The road was long and steep. He plodded steadily on, the shadows growing deeper and deeper, until the moon, round and clear, rose above the mountain top and peered pityingly through the branches upon the youth toiling onwards, his head bent with weariness and his heart heavy with sorrow. The narrow road was crossed and recrossed by many paths made by hunters and woodcutters. In some places they mingled in a confused puzzle, but he gave no heed. One path or another, it mattered not. On he went, climbing blindly upward, ever upward, towards the high, bare summit of what is now known as Obatsuyama, the mountain of the abandoning of the aged. The eyes of the old mother were not so dim, but they noted the reckless hastening from one path to another, and her loving heart grew anxious. Her son did not know the mountain's many paths, and his return might be one of danger. So she stretched forth her hand, and snapping the twigs from the bushes as they passed, she quietly dropped a handful every few steps of the way, so as they climbed the narrow path behind them was dotted at frequent intervals with tiny piles of twigs. At last the summit was reached. Weary and heartsick, the youth gently released his burden and silently prepared a place of comfort as his last duty to the loved one. Gathering fallen pine needles, he made a soft cushion, and tenderly lifting his old mother thereon, he wrapped her padded coat more closely about the stooping shoulders, and with tearful eyes and an aching heart said, "Farewell." The trembling mother voice was full of unselfish love as she gave her last injunction. "Let not thine eyes be blind, my son. The mountain road is full of danger. Look carefully and follow the path which holds the piles of twigs. They will guide thee to the familiar way further down." The son's surprised eyes looked back over the path, then at the poor old shriveled hands, all scratched and soiled by their work of love. His heart smote him, and bowing to the ground, he cried aloud, "O honourable mother, thy kindness thrusts my heart. I will not leave thee. Together we will follow the path of twigs, and together we will die." Once more he shouldered his burden, how light it seemed now, and hastened down the path through the shadows and the moonlight to the little hut in the valley. Beneath the kitchen floor was a walled closet for food, which was covered over and hidden from view. There the son hid his mother, supplying her with every needful and continually watching and fearing. Time passed, and he was beginning to feel safe, when again the despot sent forth heralds, bearing an unreasonable and useless order, seemingly as a boast of his power. His demand was that his subjects should present him with a rope of ashes. The entire province trembled with dread. The order must be obeyed, yet who in all Shinano could make a rope of ashes? One night, in great distress, the son whispered the news to his hidden mother. "Wait," she said, "I will think." On the second day she told him what to do. "Make a rope of twisted straw," she said, "then stretch it upon a row of flat stones and burn it there on a windless night." He called the people together and did as she said, and when the blaze had died, behold, upon the stones, with every twist and fibre showing perfect, lay a rope of whitened ashes. The daimyo was pleased at the wit of the youth and praised him greatly, but demanded to know where he had obtained his wisdom. "Alas, alas," cried the farmer, "the truth must be told." And with many deep bows he related his story. The daimyo listened, then meditated in silence. Finally he lifted his head. "Shinano needs more than the strength of youth," he said gravely. "Ah, that I should have forgotten the well-known saying, 'With the crown of snow there cometh wisdom.'" That very hour the cruel law was abolished, and the custom drifted into so far a past that only the legend remains. As we went farther on, I found the customs so different from those of Nagaoka that I felt as if I were already in a strange land. At one place, long before we reached the village, we heard a hoarse voice crying, "Makata! Makata! Is it sold? Is it sold?" And as we rolled through the one narrow crowded streets, we saw an auctioneer standing high in the midst of dozens of bamboo baskets of beans, carrots, greens and bamboo shoots, while lying around him in ungainly confusion were every size and shape of purple eggplant and long, sprawling, delicious lotus roots. Brother looked back and laughed. "Who is he? What were all the people doing?" I asked as soon as we reached the end of the long street and rolled out onto the public road. "It is a vegetable auction," Brother explained. "Merchants buy in quantities, and every morning the things are auctioned off by the basketful. Weren't those fine lotus roots? If we hadn't had breakfast only a couple of hours ago, I believe I was hungry." At another place we went by a house where death had entered. Before the door stood a funeral palanquin, into which the unskilled workers with big hats and crest coats were just lifting the heavy wooden bucket containing the body. Over it was thrown a small kimono of scarlet and gold, showing that the dead child must have been a little daughter. The dress would have been white for a son. Around stood a number of white-robed mourners with white towels folded over their hair. As we passed, I caught a glimpse of a screen placed upside down and the lighted candles of a tiny shrine. At one place, where the road ran close to a broad river with bold bluffs coming down in some places almost to the water, we saw a number of odd floating rice mills with turning paddle wheels that looked like a fleet of boats standing motionless in a hopeless struggle against a strong tide. I wondered where in that rocky country were enough people to eat all the rice that was being ground. But when we turned away from the river, we suddenly found ourselves in a silk culture district, where our road ran through village after village, each having its own mulberry plantation. The town where we expected to spend the night was only a few hours ahead, when the sky began to darken with a threatening storm. Brother was casting anxious looks behind when his jinricksha man told him that in the next village was a large house where travellers had sometimes been kept for a night. So we hurried there, the last quarter of an hour being a bouncing, breathless race between men and clouds. The men won, whirling us up to the door, in which we ran unannounced, just as the storm broke with a downpour which it would have been hard to struggle through on the road. It was an odd house where I had found shelter, but I know that even my honourable father on his journeys in ancient days never on any occasion received a more cordial welcome or more kindly treatment than did we and our perspiring, laughing, boasting men at the end of our exciting race. End of part 6. If you are enjoying our audiobooks, please take the time to subscribe, press like, make a comment, or share this audiobook station with other friends who also enjoy listening. Thank you.